Well, after that little interlude with 2 videos of examining property and theft, I wanted to return to my series on World War II. I want to wrap it up. I think I'm going to make 2 more videos about it. This will be the first of those 2. And in this I want to address a question that I can't answer completely, but I think that if we try and arrive at an answer, we will go a long way towards dispelling some of the myths about World War II and also cast it in a more accurate and illuminating light than it is in most popular culture. And that is the question of why did Hitler declare war on the United States? This is a very important, momentous event, a singular act, and it's amazing because it is so little talked about, which is understandable to an extent. I mean, Pearl Harbor was a major event, absolutely out of the blue as far as most Americans were concerned. The debate rages as to how surprised certain elements of the military and the government were, but if you were just a regular American, this would probably have struck you as just absolutely amazing. And for our younger generation, I remember my grandmother, when 9/11 happened, she basically said that that was the only thing that ever came anywhere close to being like Pearl Harbor was 9/11, and yet I would say Pearl Harbor would be much more significant because Al-Qaeda, which is what people were thinking even that very day, it's a terrorist organization. Japan is a powerful state, and there was already a war, a very intense, actually the most intense war ever was already raging, and so there would have been, I would say, even more kind of gravitas to the moment than 9/11, although I can't directly compare. She actually compared them as similar, although, you know, who knows. But that was such a big deal that when a couple days later Hitler declared war on the United States, although it obviously made the papers and people at the time talked about it, it has almost been completely obliterated from our memory of the war. When people make narratives of the war, they don't talk about it. And I never thought about it for a long time. And the justifications for why that I encountered over the years were relatively vague. Basically, there's a common kind of conclusion a lot of people come to and says, well, Japan and Germany were allies, hence Japan was at war with the United States, so Germany obviously would declare war on the United States as well. It is true that they were allies, they had a treaty, but the terms of the treaty did not put Germany under any obligation whatsoever to declare war on the United States in this circumstance. They would have been required to do so under the terms of the treaty, which is not to say that they would have followed the treaty, but under the terms, had the United States attacked Japan, and not the other way around. And that's not what happened, basically. Although you could debate and say, well, we had an oil embargo and all that, and those are acts of war. Maybe they're acts of wars, but they're not attacks, per se. In any event, it was not a treaty obligation that brought Germany into the war. And that is, for people, and I'm certainly not the first ever, obviously, to ask why then did it happen. There's not a lot of clear reasons. One of the problems is that Hitler did not typically just tell people, well, listen, this is my thought process, and this is why I am doing something. Also, among the people in his close circle, they were careful not to record too much, not to speculate too much. A lot of those people died. The ones who didn't die, or before they died, had very good reasons to misrepresent the past. And so it's very hard to say with much certainty what they really thought, and even if they really believed something, whether that was true or not, they may have been misled. Hitler did give a rather lengthy speech when he declared war on the United States, I have it on my computer. You can find it. Apparently, there are a whole lot of very bad copies of it. I guess the day after he delivered the speech in the Reichstag, the New York Times printed a transcript of it, which is actually kind of amazing how they would get a transcript translated that fast, how they would get it across the ocean. This is before the internet, obviously. It's rather lengthy. I think it's like 88 pages long or something like that. I've not read the whole thing. I've read parts of it. Parts I've read have basically stated things that he made a case that there was casus belli, that the United States had done aggressive things to Germany, which is true. That the United States was actively aiding belligerent powers against Germany, especially the UK, and that's also true, and that was kind of the reason. I've seen it in the History Channel, which most of my subscribers may have noticed. There's a meme going around on Facebook. It's well overdue. It shows a pie chart of what the History Channel talks about. And a quarter of it is Nazis, a quarter of it is aliens, a quarter of it is doomsday prophecies. Almost all the rest is lumberjacks, pawn stars, and storage brokers, and then there's a tiny, tiny sliver, and it says everything else. But Nazis is one of those, and they will talk a lot about Hitler having contempt for the United States, which is not something. If you read Mein Kampf, he actually seems to laud the United States. In fact, as an autocrat, as somebody who wanted his state to be to adhere to a principle of autarky where it would have all the resources it needs, he really saw the United States as being a state that had achieved that already, and a state that was racist in a way that he liked, that had all these minorities who we were able to get labor from, who served in our military, who we were able to exploit, but who were an underclass nonetheless. And he even, I believe, goes so far as to say it's amazing. It's really amazing is that they have this somehow convincing pretension of liberty and equality too that's in the Declaration and the Constitution. So I mean, they have second-class citizens, the slave class, and he didn't mean just the blacks, but he also meant all of Latin America that he thought was tied into our industrial complex, which is correct. And yet, we didn't. People weren't castigating the United States as horribly racist or anything. I mean, not very often. It did happen. There were people who said that, but it was not like, oh, the Americans are so evil, blah, 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 all the time. And he thought, this is just great. I mean, in a lot of ways, he wanted to emulate the United States in that sense. But I have heard, although I have not read the writings, that later he started to say, no, they've been corrupted by Jewishness and their weak will and whatever. And I don't know how much of that is ex post facto propaganda or kind of intended to say, hey, it's not that bad, we can win because the Americans are, a debauched society or whatever. So I don't know how much he really honestly believed that, but needless to say, none of the things that he points out were new at that point. The United States had been actively aiding Britain since at least 1940, even in a explicit military sense. I mean, giving them military equipment, occupying lands on their behalf, obviously giving them tons of money, all sorts of moral support. That hadn't suddenly changed in December of 1941. And it has to be stated that, the United States, even if you want to say it's debauched, it's still rich, it's still powerful. It seems like an awful risk to declare war on it. It's been pointed out that it would have been rather difficult for the United States to have engaged in the war if Germany had not done the favor of doing this. Japan, obviously there was enormous bloodlust against Japan, and the war with Japan would be unusually intense and bloody, not the greatest in scale. I mean, a battle on a tiny atoll cannot involve millions of soldiers, but the fighting that would occur on each individual little island, or some of the islands rather large actually, was as intense as fighting anywhere. I'm just saying in scale it would be far less than, say, the Eastern Front or something like that. And why that would lead to us to declare war on Germany is not clear. I would have imagined that had Germany not declared war, they would have found a way to do it, but there wouldn't have been the intensity fight the Germans as there subsequently was, although there never was the intensity to fight the Germans as there was the Japanese. You can count that by looking at how many prisoners were taken on each side. I know the Japanese maybe didn't like to surrender as much, but that's not the only reason. Now, to answer this question, I was thinking about making this video a few weeks ago, and I went online and I researched it, and I actually did find a very plausible explanation. It's not definitive. It's not one that I can prove, but it made an awful lot of sense to me, more so than anything I'd ever read before, and I'm going to talk about that, but first I want to do a little lead-up. One very common narrative you like to hear, and this is not true just in World War II, but basically in every war, is an attempt to say, well, at some point the tables turned, you know. So in the Civil War, people would say Gettysburg or the Battle of Vicksburg is kind of like the point where the North started to win, or the World War I, actually, it's a much trickier issue because it may not have really tipped until the spring and early summer of 1918, which is towards the end of the war. In World War II, if we look at the Pacific theater, it's very, very common to point to the Battle of Midway, which is kind of misleading because it's not misleading covertly because the name of the battle, Midway, sounds like it's midway through the war. People think of turning points as happening somewhere in the middle, but the Battle of Midway happens, 6 or 7 months after the war starts, and that's the turning point that America was winning the war in the Pacific from a very early date, which is actually correct. I don't know, at least I always conceptually kind of thought, oh, it's in the middle of the war, when really it was towards the beginning. With Germany, there's a lot of points where people say this is where they started to lose the war, and one of the most popular ones is Stalingrad, and there's a certain logic to that. That was a very explicit military defeat, one that was acknowledged at the time, and the Germans said this is bad, this is not good. They lost an entire army. Americans will sometimes say D-Day. That's putting it rather late and emphasizing the Allies a bit much. But the way I've looked at it is that the point of Germany's has no way of really winning this war is much, much earlier than I think most people think. The nature of the conflict changed once it began, and so I don't think there's any reason to suppose that when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, that necessarily it would have progressed the way that it could. The war could have ended with the annexation of Poland. It could have ended with the defeat of France, and I actually think the evidence is this is what Hitler thought would happen. Hitler, I think, was betting that France and the UK would not intervene on the behalf of Poland, and he was wrong. But I think he was also thinking that, well, even if they do, I'll be able to take out France, which was correct. And he actually had an active role in that, for which he deserves some credit, at least in terms of a tactician. I'd highly recommend Manstein's book, Lost Victories. He talks about that. He says Hitler was no mere corporal. He did have an understanding of military strategy that was notable. I don't want to say considerable, but he was impressed by it. But anyway, Hitler, after the fall of France, actually offered terms to Great Britain. They weren't very good terms, by the way, but Churchill refused. And Hitler seems to have been kind of surprised by this. Hitler's view was that Germany has its interests, and they are in establishing some kind of hegemonic Eastern European state, either by direct annexation or by some kind of colonial system. The exact precise nature of which it started to actually form later, but it never got past the embryonic stage, so who's to say exactly how it would have developed. His wishes on how it will develop kind of changed, so we're not exactly positive. And he saw the British as their focus as having this empire. He did not see the two as mutually exclusive. And so the way he looked at it is there's no reason we can't be friends. What he was not considering or not weighing enough was that historically Great Britain has not accepted a hegemon on Europe. Whoever looks like they're going to rule Europe, England has tried to thwart, whether that was the Spanish, whether that was Louis XIV, or Napoleon, or in the 20th century, the Germans. They ally whoever your enemies are. I guess they figure as long as Europe's fragmented, they're pretty safe. I guess this is true since they have been pretty safe historically. Of course, when they were actually successfully invaded, Europe was fragmented in a way far greater than it ever has been since, really, in 1066. But the UK resolved to continue fighting the war. And I would say that actually at this point, that is, if not Germany is going to lose the war, at the very least cannot win. This is a stalemate situation. Now, Germany had a larger army, a better army, and had England been connected to Europe by Doggerland, the name of the area that connected the two prior to the melting of the glaciers, then I don't think there's any real question that the German state could have conquered Great Britain, although in that scenario, history would be almost invariably unrecognizably different because England would not be an island. But England is an island, and so that's a moot point. If England's going to fight, then Germany has two options. One is to either invade and conquer directly. The other is to starve it out. Now, Manstein says that he believes had they been able to invade England, he does not think that the war could have continued. He thinks Churchill might have fled. He could have gone to Canada or any number of other colonies. They could have decided they wanted to keep fighting, but they would have been in a real bad situation. In terms of the prospects for success of such an invasion, I actually tend to think that they were rather slim. Manstein seems to think that it would have been difficult, though not impossible, if they had done it right. Although, not to compare my understanding of it to his, there has been subsequent data made available that he did not know about that I think might have changed his assessment. Basically, the German army, the Wehrmacht, said, yes, if we can get to the shores, that's fine, but he goes, but if we are going to be attacked by the British Navy and the British Air Force as we attempt a channel crossing, it will never work. We'll be slaughtered in mass. Some of the soldiers will get there, but it won't be in cohesive units enough to counter their forces, even if their forces are not particularly strong. And so the precondition of an invasion, the successful one, would be the elimination of both the British Navy and the British Air Force, at least in the regions where a crossing would happen, someplace in the Channel. And the British Navy, fair enough, certainly enough, can actually be chased away, if not destroyed, by the Luftwaffe, but only if the RAF is not present. And so the linchpin of this operation is air superiority over Great Britain, over at least the southeast portion of it. Not air parity. We can't have Luftwaffe planes alone. They have to have superiority. We can't have Spitfires and Hurricanes strafing our barges or our ships. And so that's what the so-called Battle of Britain was all about, where the Luftwaffe set about to do this. They waged a war on the RAF. It was a very intense war. It was a very concerted effort. But at that moment, even though the Luftwaffe had a slight advantage in terms of the number of planes, this was largely negated by the fact that they would be flying a greater distance. I mean, I think most of the fighters could only have a maximum of maybe 20 minutes flying time over the UK. That's assuming they were as close as they could be. So they didn't have a lot of time to get the job done. They had to do all the commutes. Also, if their planes crashed or their pilots had to bail out, that would mean that those pilots would be gone. Whereas the UK, if they lost a pilot, if he bailed out, he would land in the English. I mean, that was a risky thing. He might die anyway, but he would be able to fly. There were cases of British pilots jumping out of their planes and flying again that very same day. That obviously could not happen with a Luftwaffe pilot. Although I might want to say that the Luftwaffe pilots were slightly better, they would not have been in a class above the RAF pilots. They were very well trained. And the thing that Manstein did not know that I do, because I've looked at the figures, is that at this time the war production of airplanes in the UK was double the production in Germany. So in a war of attrition, the side that's outproducing the other by 2, just on the factory floor, let alone in the actual dogfighting, is going to win. Also combine this with the fact that German industry was constantly having bottlenecks, constantly going to have to shift resources. If Hitler decided he wanted to invade the Soviet Union, which he eventually did, they would have to stop making so many planes and start making more tanks. This is exactly what happened. UK, although it would be wrong to say that they had all the resources they could possibly desire, they had enough to keep their industrial base going at full capacity, basically. The other possible scenario, one that has actually been examined a great deal, is the U-boat potential to eliminate, to basically strangle the UK. This has to be admitted is a plausible line of action. It's something that almost worked in World War I. However, at the start of this engagement, the Kriegsmarine did not actually have a large number of U-boats. This actually strikes a lot of people as very odd, but in the interim period, there were advances made in sonar, and a lot of military strategists actually thought the U-boats would basically be easily detectable, and so not a very useful weapon, and so they were not emphasized very much. The German Navy, when Hitler came to power, he basically asked all the services what they would like. The German Navy basically wanted an imperial navy, so they went around building battleships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, along with a large number of other surface ships, and even started constructing at least 1 or 2 aircraft carriers. And although they had a U-boat fleet, they didn't build that many at the start of the war. They only had, I think, maybe a dozen or so that were really ready to go, active service. Dönitz was saying if they could have maybe 100, that would be enough. The estimates of the tonnage they'd have to sink, I think it was something in the area of 600,000 tons a month. If they could do that for 13 months, they figured the UK would be done for. The absolute most they ever got in World War II was about half that, and that was only in 1 or 2 month stints. And basically they had to start ramping up the U-boats after the war already started. They didn't start with enough, and so the UK was able to ramp up its anti-U-boat, and the bottom line is, being a Kriegsmarine, Untersee boatsman, was basically the most dangerous job anybody in any army in all of World War II could have. I think their casualty rate was over 50%. It's worse than the kamikazes, I think. I think it was like even 80%. Don't quote me on that, though. It was more than half. So I look at that scenario and I say Germany can't even win the war. Now, rather than, and Manstein talks about this, like, okay, Hitler should have sat down and said, what are we going to do? We should do something, because we have a stalemate here, and what he decided to do was crazy, basically. I don't think Hitler was insane, but what he did, this was a crazy act. He basically thought that the British were holding out hope that someday the Soviet Union would intervene, and that at that point they would win, which is true. The two powers together would almost certainly defeat Germany. Hitler was aware of this, and he thought, well, if I can take out the Soviet Union, then that hope will be gone, and the English will submit. They'll come to terms. Of course, then by doing this, he would break his own rule. He'd written many times that fighting a war on 2 fronts was, crazy and suicide, and yet he was decided to gamble on this. I think he convinced himself the Soviet Union was weaker than it was. A part of this has to do with the Soviet invasion of Finland in the winter of 1939. That's kind of like a forgotten war, where the Soviets they eventually won, but they had a huge number of terrible setbacks. Hundreds of thousands, if not even 1 million, I'm not sure, Soviet soldiers, if not died, were at least casualties in that war. And the Germans basically said, if the Finns can do that, we could just imagine what we can do. The carnage we can wreck, and of course they wrecked an unbelievable amount of carnage when it actually happened. And so Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Now, Operation Barbarossa is a very famous event because it is literally in and of itself a larger scale operation than any other war in history. In terms of the numbers killed, the number of tanks, the number of planes, the number of everything, the number of divisions, and it is a staggering. It's always remembered for the sheer volume of Soviet materiel and personnel that were obliterated in that conflict. Just losses that are incalculable. I mean, they have battles where more people would be taken prisoner or killed than the United States lost in the entire war. Either the World War I, or either World War II, or even the Civil War. I mean, just titanic, brutal, terrible war. Well, this is going to get me to the answer to this question, trust me. Germany invaded, along with its allies, the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. So this is 6 months before Pearl Harbor, 6-7, whatever. And although they met with tremendous success, even by July, the whole, I should premise this, the military, when states have militaries, they calculate how large an army they can have. At some point they say, look, we can have an army that's so big and we can maintain it forever because we have the resources that we can fully equip it as long as it needs to be. A larger army, this becomes more difficult, and there's a point where they get, okay, we can have an army that's this big, but only for a certain amount of time. And then you get to the point where they can't even field an army that's so large. It's kind of a surprising fact, but even though the United States had a larger population by far than Germany, I think more than double, our total mobilization was actually less. If you looked at the maximum number of soldiers in the Wehrmacht, it was greater than the number of soldiers in the United States. But basically, the U.S. military had said, look, we don't want to sacrifice our industrial capability. We don't want to sacrifice our farm production. They calculated what was the number of people that they could take out of the workforce into the army and not really affect that, or affect it to the point where they wouldn't be able to work at full production. And that's how big the army was. And it was like, I don't remember exactly, maybe 12 million, something like that. And that's going to be good enough, and we can keep that army supplied with as much stuff as it needs, as long as it needs to be in the field. The Germans, because of the obligations of their numerous fronts that they were on, needed to call up far, far more soldiers, and so their industry was always suffering, always suffering. And actually, they surpassed their own estimates, because when they invaded the Soviet Union, basically all the generals said, this war needs to end this year. We cannot go into the winter with this army. It's too big for us to sustain, but it's also too small to occupy the entire Soviet Union. So we have, and continue to fight. I mean, if we... And so all the plans for the invasion were that the war would have to be over by, say, Christmas or by winter, which is an extraordinarily daunting task to be set upon. And despite their successes, even by July, there started to be kind of well, we're doing well, but we have to do exceptionally well for this to even work. Once the autumn rains began, there were serious logistical problems, which actually kind of started before that. There were periods in July and August where entire armies would basically have to stop and wait a few days just to get fuel enough to keep operating. This became catastrophic in the fall. There also was a pause where Hitler said, let's, instead of keep going to Moscow, let's shore up our flanks, and they surrounded Kiev in the so-called Battle of Kiev, the largest battle in history, some people say, where they took, I think, 600,000 prisoners, which is just an astronomically huge number. It tells you how willing the Russians were to fight for Stalin, because 600,000 men would have the means to resist, but just opted not to. I'd love to go into that too. I think if Hitler had been really smart, instead of waging a racist war of annihilation against the Slavs, he would have found somebody in Europe who had a legitimate claim to maybe being the next Tsar and said, listen, we're liberating you from Stalin, and if he had treated them better, if he had not basically raped the indigenous population, if he had treated the prisoners well, I think he actually might have had a chance. But as it was, they treated them with such disregard that that was never going to happen. That's a total other side. Anyway, by that fall, it became evident that the Soviet government was not going to give up. The Soviet army, though it had sustained losses greater than any army ever in history ever has, was still fighting and still raising. I mean, they would destroy an army and another army would appear, and then another army, and then another army, and then another. And that winter, Manstein talks about how they were aware that they had inflicted these huge losses, but they were also aware that the Soviets still had entire armies in the Caucasus, in Siberia, around Moscow, entire army groups, entire fronts, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of soldiers that had not even been engaged yet. They hadn't even fired a single shot in anger. And he looked at that as, we are done for. There's no way. Because at that point, the German forces were on a shoestring. They were at the end of their line. There came to be a realization that they would not win the war that winter. But then what Hitler kind of did was, okay, well, we're not going to win this winter, but we need to get into a good position to win next year. So there was still kind of get one more town, one more bridgehead, one more river crossing. And this process led them all the way almost to Moscow, although they were close to Moscow. They were not in any position to take it. And what happened just before Pearl Harbor is the Soviets started to use some of these forces that hadn't been utilized yet. Famously, the Siberians under Zhukov, I think they transferred about 40 divisions of what were really some of the best troops in the Soviet Union and who were equipped to fight in the winter, who had experience fighting the Japanese, actually, slamming into exhausted, skeletal, basically, German forces that were out of gas, that machines wouldn't even work, too far away from their air bases to have consistent, worthwhile Luftwaffe support. After having felt enormous casualties, I think only about 50,000 Germans died, which is a lot, but not staggering. But the number who were taken prisoner or incapacitated by injuries or disease were more like 1 million. I mean, it was a huge number. A lot of those soldiers were eventually able to come back, more than half, but it was very much at the end of their strength. And what ended up happening is they had to give up a vast area of Russia that they had already conquered, a huge area. And this is actually a greater defeat in scale than what happened at Stalingrad. I mean, by far. And this initial winter campaign is de-emphasized. I don't know why. And that's to be, and in here is where we find a very plausible explanation for Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. A hope that by declaring war on the United States, who at that point was not really in a position to do much more than it already had been against Germany, that Japan would reciprocate and declare war on the Soviet Union, and in so doing maybe draw some of these forces back to Siberia. It was an act of desperation. I mean, it was a desperate gamble, declaring war on the United States, the most powerful country in the world by far. I mean, literally by any measure. People always like to say, oh, it was the 16th largest military. Yeah, because it was a peacetime army. Because we're not a whole bunch of militarists, because America's not about making the state as powerful as possible, at least it used to not be. But the industrial output capacity created by free market capitalism, no less, more or less free market capitalism, was insurmountably huge, and you would only risk that if you were absolutely desperate. Like they were going to use, they were going to lose the war unless something happened. But the something he was hoping for is maybe Japan would attack eastern Siberia. Maybe that would draw some of the Soviet forces away enough for the Germans to either broker a peace or, finish the job. As it turned out, the Japanese had bitten off more than they could chew. I think that they realized that. There was great hesitation on their part to provoke the United States. If you ask me, they would have been far wiser to have done all of their conquering in Southeast Asia and not attack the United States. Then there never would have been the fervent war fever that there eventually was. It would have been hard for Roosevelt to get a declaration of war, and even if he had, I think he could have arranged it so he could have gotten it. There would not have been the enthusiasm, and Americans might have been much more willing to quit earlier. I mean, later in the war, the Japanese were hoping, well, we'll inflict these casualties and maybe they'll retreat. Maybe they'll come to a settlement. Well, by attacking first, they basically made that impossible. However, if they had not attacked the United States first, that would have been a much more likely outcome. That also would have been a gamble. So Hitler declared war on the United States. I would guess, this isn't something I invented, I read this and it sounded the most plausible thing I'd ever read, out of desperation in an attempt to get the Japanese to aid him in a war that he was losing already, before the United States gets involved. And if I don't say that, I mean, I think that at the Battle of Britain, Germany was doomed to lose. But if not there, this first campaign, the winter campaign of 1941, an unmitigated disaster of a kind the German army had not ever really seen before. Even in World War I, after the Battle of the Marne, where they retreated from most of France, was not anywhere near as big of a defeat as this. And they never recouped the numbers. The Wehrmacht was never as powerful again after this. And people talk about Stalingrad. Well, this first invasion, the Germans invaded with 3 army groups, North, South, and Central. And all 3 of them were immensely powerful. Even the weakest one had almost 1 million soldiers and thousands of tanks and thousands of planes. That would be Army Group North, was the weakest initially. In 1942, the offensive that culminated in Stalingrad, that's so well known, Germany did not have the power to actually launch those 3 fronts, or those fronts, what the Russians call it, those 3 army groups again. They only had the resources to have one of those army groups fight, and that was Army Group South, and that's when the Crimea was conquered. That's when they almost took some of the oil fields, and that's when Stalingrad happened. But the whole point is that that whole thrust is like less than a third as powerful as the one they need. So at this point, Germany is like a fighter who's already had the wind knocked out of him and who's about to get his face bashed in the most violent way ever in history. And that's what essentially happens over the next 3 years, 3.5 years. So that's why, because Germany was desperate. And that will segue into my next video, hopefully my final one on World War II.